I want to tell the story of how General Andrew Jackson was fresh off his latest massacre when he got the assignment to lead an army of lawyers, whores, Choctaw braves, and black guys to save America from destruction, along with a gang of pirates. So I was really excited to say that, but we should back up and talk about the history. In about 20 years after George Washington had basically stopped being president, he decided that he was only going to do 2 terms. The country was in a little bit of trouble because King George III and his son, who I call 4G, decided that they wanted to pay themselves back for the losses that they had in the revolution. So they lost a bunch of money on this revolution. They'd just been fighting Napoleon. So they sent a bunch of ships to the east coast of America, just in international waters, to basically pirate goods from American boats, and anyone with a British accent they would conscript into the British Navy. So this was obviously very annoying to the newfound republic, and so Thomas Jefferson, who was the president at the time, he had a solution to this problem, which was just to ban all imports and exports, which immediately destroyed the economy. Historians say this is maybe one of the dumbest things any president has ever done. Thomas Jefferson was very good at writing declarations of independence. It turns out not very good at trade or international affairs. So he destroys the economy, and then we're out of money. So to deal with that, he says, well, let's privatize the military now. So get rid of the military. All that budget money goes back to the government, and this turned out to be a problem when the British then invaded. They burnt down the White House. They sacked all these cities up and down the East Coast, and from Maryland to Virginia. And meanwhile, all of these American companies that they survived off of trading goods in international shipments, their goods rotted on the wharfs, and the economy was doing terrible, basically. People started starving, companies started going out of business, and the British were fine. So what happened basically is, this has never happened in America before or since, but everyone basically flipped out of each other and they took sides. The Democratic Republicans burnt down the newspapers of their Federalist rivals. The Federalists were like, let's join the British. And so it was this sort of horrible situation that happened just after this new country had started. And this is around the time that King George III and 4G said, hey, maybe we can actually take this land back. So the country's in shambles, everyone's mad at each other, they're super broke now, and they have no military. And so they decided to do it, basically. So they looked at the map and they said, hey, we've burnt down all these cities, taken over most of the East Coast. All we got to do is sail up the Mississippi River, and we can push the Americans into the Atlantic. So this is one of those things that in American history class, we learn about the Revolutionary War, and we learn about the Civil War, and there's like one line that the history teacher usually says, and there was a war in 1812. But this is the story of what happened in the War of 1812. The British decided they were going to push the Americans into the Atlantic, so they had sacked all of these cities. The North was ready to join the British already, but there's one thing standing in the way of this plan, and it's a little town, sort of a raucous town at the mouth of the Mississippi River called New Orleans. So this was the spot that they had to get past in order to go up the Mississippi and do the land invasion to take over America. So while everyone in the United States were suffering from kind of this poverty that the import-export ban had happened and all these people in all these cities had been sacked, while that was going on, New Orleans was throwing this big party. This is actually a picture of me and my friends in New Orleans. I'm there on the right-hand side. I'm like a cop from 1979, I think. So that was Halloween. So they're doing this while everything else was happening. And this is thanks to some local heroes known as the Pirate Brothers Lafitte. So this group of pirate brothers was keeping New Orleans in this nonstop party. These are them. So this is Pierre Lafitte. He ran the blacksmith shop where they would smuggle goods in and then distribute them to the city of New Orleans. Lots of rum and fine silks and rugs and all sorts of things. There was Dominique Lafitte, who was the guy that would sail around the Caribbean and pirate boats and take the goods to be smuggled into New Orleans. And then there was sort of the PR guy, the face of the pirate brotherhood, Jean Lafitte. So I know that this is what he's supposed to look like if we're going with movies of pirates, but when they make the movie about the War of 1812, this is who I want playing Jean Lafitte. It's Ryan Gosling. Anyway, Eric knows I'm a big Ryan Gosling fan. So what was happening is these pirate brothers were basically keeping the city full of rum, and the rule was that you were actually legally allowed to plunder any ship in international waters as long as your country was at war with them. So the British, when they started plundering these American boats, they weren't at war, and then they declared war, and so then it was legal. So these pirate brothers, they actually didn't refer to themselves as pirates. They called themselves captains and privateers because they sailed under letters of marque of Cartagena, which is a city-state that was conveniently at war with everyone. So they were at war with everyone, so they could legally plunder these boats. But then the problem was getting the goods from New Orleans, or from the ocean, basically from the Caribbean to New Orleans, required them to import stuff, which was illegal at the time. So what they would do, they had this little set of islands that they would basically dock their ships at, and then they would row the goods through the swamps, and they would mysteriously appear in New Orleans, and everyone was having a good time, partying, drinking rum. So this is going on while the British are taking over America. And as long as the pirates kept the city in rum, they left them alone. So they sort of turned a blind eye to this. But Jean Lafitte, being the smart and handsome man that he was stockpiling cannons and flints and tinders just in case they ever came for him. So the British army assembled this enormous armada, the largest armada ever to set sail to sea. And they had just defeated Napoleon, so they're feeling pretty confident about this. And they took a look at the map, and they said, well, we have to get up the twisting curves of the Mississippi River, and we have to knock out the New Orleans defense, basically, if we want to make this plan work. So they couldn't get their ships up the river very quickly. So they said, let's do a ground invasion. We'll knock out the defenses, then we'll sail our ships up, which meant that they would have to kind of go through this swamp and sneak attack the city of New Orleans. So British have about 20,000 troops and all of these ships. So they park the ships outside of New Orleans, ready to put the troops and sneakily get through the swamp to take over New Orleans. And that's around the time that the colonel of the British troops, the he that's in here, Colonel Nichols was his name, he paid a visit to Jean Lafitte and apparently his dog, and offered him $2 million to help them sneak through the swamp so they could surprise attack the city of New Orleans. And Jean Lafitte, being a pirate, said, yeah, sure, I'll take your money. And then they went back to the Armada ready to get ready for the surprise attack, and Jean Lafitte immediately double-crossed them because he was a pirate. So he went and he told the government of New Orleans immediately this plan that the British were going to sneak invade, and which obviously everyone freaked out about. But this was interesting timing because the state government had just declared war on the pirates. So the state was upset that the pirates were doing these illegal imports and that the city of New Orleans wasn't doing anything. So the governor had just barely declared a $500 reward for the capture of Jean Lafitte. And Jean Lafitte, being cocky and sexy, he posted up handbills all around the state for a $5,000 reward for the capture of Governor Claiborne. So this pissed off the government. And so they sent a crew to basically raid their little pirate island where they were importing all this stuff. I'm going to get to the point of this soon. But at the same time, they were double-crossing the British. All the pirates were hiding their shit in the swamp from the government. And what happened around this time is Pierre Lafitte had actually been captured. He had been arrested as part of this government raid. He mysteriously escaped from prison around the time that Jean Lafitte told the government about this British plan. So you can kind of see what's going on. He traded the information for his brother's release, and then the pirates disappeared. So they said, hey, the British are coming, we're out. Hid all their stuff in the swamp. So the new president of the United States, Madison, he freaked out because the country is going down the tubes, the British are going to take over, and they had no army, there's no military. There's only one person he could call. And this was a little-known militia commander who had been busy basically harassing and murdering Native Americans and sort of clearing out Tennessee for the settlers, basically. A controversial figure named Andrew Jackson, who, like the pirates, was also a complicated fellow. He had recently attempted to kill his own governor for some insult, and he just massacred a bunch of natives, and in a strange twist, adopted an American Indian baby. Very complicated, strange guy, if strange is the right word to use for him. And he was called to go lead some sort of defense of the city of New Orleans. And he was nursing a bullet wound at the time when he got the call, because the story is crazy. He'd been shot after trying to horsewhip some dude. I had to put it up there so I could kind of remember, who'd gotten mad when his friend shot that dude's friend in the butt. So we can go over this again to make sure the sequence is clear. A guy mooned Andrew Jackson's buddy. So Andrew Jackson's buddy shot him in the butt, and that guy's friend got mad. Makes sense. So Jackson then horsewhipped that guy for being mad, and that guy shot Jackson in the arm. So anyway, Andrew Jackson shows up to the city of New Orleans with his arm in a sling and diarrhea, because he has dysentery, from the journey, I guess, in those days. I don't really know how to spell dysentery. No one does. So he shows up, and the situation is not good, because all they have to defend the city from these 20,000 British troops are 200 local businessmen, a contingent of feisty local whores who'd signed up for ammo duty, and he brought with him 1,800 Tennessee hunters. They called them dirty shirts. These guys had never really fought a war, but they were hunters with these long, slow rifles that had kind of been part of these Indian skirmishes. There was also a platoon of free men of color who hadn't been paid in a while, but they were part of a local militia that had been disbanded, and he offered to pay them if they joined up. There's a crew of Choctaw Braves, 62 American Indian Braves who, for some reason, were willing to help this guy and these people who had been, kind of treating them badly. And Andrew Jackson promised to pay them, and he gave this rousing speech where he said, I know we have our differences, but let's set aside those differences for a second, and let's save the city and maybe the country from these people that want to invade our homeland. So he gave this speech, and everyone cheered, and then he went back to his room and he shit himself because of the dysentery, and also because the British had this enormous army against his 3,000 misfits, none of whom had ever fought a war before, like a real war. And so he's like, he knows that this is a lost cause and that he's going to die. And all of these people who he just convinced to defend the city are also going to die. And he knew what had happened in these cities on the East Coast that had been sacked and pillaged and burned, and like what the soldiers did to the families and the women of these soldiers that they've killed. And everyone was rightly freaked out by this. So around this time, Andrew Jackson, with his dysentery, gets a visit from a lawyer, a guy named Edward Livingston, who was kind of like the Saul Goodman of those days, if anyone knows Saul Goodman. This guy shows up and he says, there's another group of people who could potentially join your army. He says, who? He says, well, it's Jean Lafitte and his merry band of privateers. Look at this good-looking guy. And Andrew Jackson says, no, I don't deal with pirates. Are you kidding? They're criminals. We're not going to do this. Saul Goodman says, well, they have a bunch of cannons. He says, actually, yes. Okay, bring them on. So Jean Lafitte becomes, this is why this should be a movie. Jean Lafitte becomes a co-strategist of the defense force. So he and Andrew Jackson become the generals of this ragtag army. So now Andrew Jackson, if I haven't made it clear, I don't really like this guy. He had a lot of hate in his heart. He hated Creoles, which is basically the Spanish and French descendants, the immigrant community of New Orleans. He hated pirates because they were criminals. He hated the American Indians. He was not on the right side of history when it came to black people, and he was a slave owner. And these were all the people in his army. We said, I guess this is more important for now than my personal hatred for all these people who are not like me, for whatever reason. And thus was born the most diverse army ever assembled in the history of the United States. Undermanned, outgunned, but very, very interesting ragtag group. So I love the story of hip-hop, so forgive me if you know it. How we got hip-hop is basically this idea of cognitive friction. Started with these dance parties in the Bronx, where the party was, every weekend, there would be a dance hall where they'd have two DJs. One DJ on one side, one DJ on the other side. And the game was, see which DJ can get the party to dance on their side of the dance hall. So this is all about what music you brought every week, how loud your speakers were. People would show up every week, and they'd do this party. And they'd pay money, and the DJs were all happy. And after a while, the DJs started having these hype guys kind of announcing the next song. They try to drag people over to their side of the party. So they'd say, hey, everybody, my DJ's got this great song. Come over here. Come dance. And then the MCs would start getting really into it, and they'd do these sort of fun couplets where they'd be like, hey, forgive me, anyone who watches this. Idaho, they'd be like, hey, ho, put your hands in the air. Come on, yo. Like that sort of thing. And one week, this guy named Busy Bee, who was sort of everyone's favorite, He was there hyping up his DJ, and he goes, ba-diddy-ba, bang-da-bang, diggy-diggy, put your hands in the air, y'all, that whole thing. And this other guy, the other DJ's hype man, his name was Kool Mo D, he, instead of doing the same thing like, hey, ho, come on, he says, now hold on, Busy Bee, I don't mean to be bold, but put that ba-diddy-ba bullshit on hold. And it's like record scratch, and everyone was like, what? And then he goes for 5 minutes just with these rhyming poetry, insulting Busy Bee and his music and his DJ, and everyone went nuts. They thought it was the greatest thing ever. So then the next week, imagine that happens to you. You don't show up the next week saying, hey, ho, ba-da-dee-ba. You come prepared. And this turned into this weekly battle of wits. And then it also turned into this weekly battle of dance. And you didn't show up every week with the same stuff as last week. You showed up ready for the battle. And Jay-Z was actually on Letterman's new Netflix show recently talking about this. And he said, you know, this wasn't actually about destroying each other. It was all about the party. We knew that this competition, this battle, was about making this party better. We're all in on it. You know, you wanted to win, but more people showed up. We all made more money. Or everyone made more. Jay-Z was young when this happened. But that's what this was about. But it got to the point where the DJs started hacking their equipment. Grandmaster Flash soldered on a little switch into his record player to fade down the music so he could fade up music on another record. Everyone blew their minds. Everyone then tried to do that. When they started doing electronic samples, DJs would actually crack open the equipment and add more memory so they could do better samples and beat the other guy. And so out of this competition, this friction, was born not only hip-hop, but all of the genres of music that came after it, R&B and whatever the hell dubstep is. And also actual innovation in computers came from this. And so this is, again, kind of a literal example of how innovation is actually born from the friction between the different ways of our thinking. You didn't show up doing the same thing. That would have been dumb. But if it wasn't for this competition, this battle of wits, we wouldn't have got hip-hop and all the things that came with it. So moral of the story is we need to be able to change our minds because of this stuff. We need to value the friction. We need to value the cognitive diversity if we want to get anywhere further than we can go on our own. But we need to be able to change to do it. So this, in a nutshell, explains all the reasons corporate America sucks and why we have so many problems in the world. And it's a starting point for figuring out how we can make our teams and our communities and societies better, actually leaning into these things. So speaking of impressive teams, the British Army was fucking dope. They had 20,000 troops that just beat Napoleon. And they figured out pretty quickly that Jean Lafitte wasn't going to show up to guide them through the swamp. So they're like, great, our cover's blown. But we have 7-1 odds against these misfits in this party city. They're probably all drunk anyway. So they row their boats through the swamp, and they make camp right outside of the city of New Orleans, ready to just do like a British-style ground invasion. You know, rows and rows of thousands of soldiers in their great outfits to just overrun the city, take over America. So that night, as they're camped out, they're getting ready for this battle, a ship, a pirate ship, in fact, floats down the Mississippi River and docks right off the shore of this camp of 20,000 British soldiers. And it stops and it waits. And it does nothing. And they fired some warning shots at it. And the British decide, they're like, oh, this little tiny ship, whatever. It's probably a fisherman or some idiot. And so they go to bed. They have their sentries up, but they go to bed and they're watching it. And then the pirate ship opens fire. Start just cannons after cannons after cannons, cannonballs into the camp. They're not making a dent on this army, but this is really hard to sleep. And they have to kind of like batten down, hide in the mud. They get done with all their cannonballs. They start shooting cutlery and like random things into the camp. And so this is very annoying to the British Army, obviously. There's no way that you're going to still win 7-1 odds with this going on, but they're ruining their sleep. They're really obnoxious. And then meanwhile, anyone who ran into the woods to pee would run into this guy and get tomahawked. So these Choctaw Braves were out there basically murdering anyone who got too far away from camp. And they had taught their rivals, the dirty shirt Tennessee hunters, how to climb trees and to sit in the top of a tree and assassinate anyone who was a target, basically. So the British thought this was really unchivalrous. Again, they're not making a huge dent in the army, but this is really bad for morale. They thought it was really unchivalrous. This is not how noble wars are fought. You're supposed to line up, look each other in the eyes, and do battle. This is how war was done. So Colonel Nichols, the head of the British, he sent an envoy to Jackson that night to cordially request that they meet in the field of battle and fight like men of honor. And Jackson literally said, go fuck yourself. And so he sent this envoy back, and he was like, you're invading my land, fuck you. So in the morning, the British, demoralized, tired, their friends are being murdered in the night when they go to pee. Everyone's afraid to pee. They get up, they line up, they're like, okay, we're going to do this. So Jean Lafitte and the freemen of color had teamed up to build a moat and a dirt rampart. So they lined the city with this rampart. They built it out into the swamp kind of strategically so that you had to go over this rampart. It was only about this high, but this was their defense force. And so the British, as they're tromping through the mud, they're coming up on this. Now, this is how all of the paintings show. They're like, Andrew Jackson, boldly there, no one's shooting him. When I make the movie about this, it's going to be Ryan Gosling, who was really up there manning the fort. Anyway, so what happened is the dirty shirt riflemen were waiting in the trees with their hunting rifles, and then Jackson issued everyone whiskey supplied by the pirates, and the British charge. So they line up, they charge, the defenders open fire, and it turned out that the hunting rifles that these dirty shirt riflemen had were really slow. They're not what you want in this kind of battle, but they can shoot way further than the British muskets. So they basically just assassinated all of the British leaders. They all sat on horses. They were very visible targets. And you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to do that. They did it anyway. And so the British come up, and the worst part, they were so obedient, this army, that you're supposed to take orders. You don't do anything that's, their core value was like obedience to leadership. And this one platoon of Scotsmen, the 92nd Scots, their captain yelled halt, and then he got assassinated. And so they halted, and they stayed there until like 800 of them got shot. And finally, another captain came in, and he was like, retreat, and they're like, thank God. And it's like this horrible kind of case study of actually being stuck on a mountain peak that is not the optimal one, even when probably some people there could have spoke up and said, we should probably not halt right now. Anyway, so the battle was really awful. But after the smoke cleared, from the first assault, the British had lost 3,500 men. And the Americans had lost 333. So 7-1 odds against them, but 10-1 casualties in their favor. The British realized this is going to be way too hard. We're not going to make this happen. So they went home, and New Orleans threw a party. And this is the reason why we don't have the Queen on our $5 bill, is because of this. And that party hasn't stopped, by the way, in New Orleans. Because of this ragtag group of misfits that defended that city in that outrageous, overwhelming odds. So Andrew Jackson went on to become a national hero, even though he was kind of an awful person. They didn't have the internet, so they couldn't find out that he was a racist promise breaker. He stiffed his contractors, by the way. He didn't pay any of the free men of color for that, even though he promised them. But he became president anyway. Edward Livingston, Saul Goodman, became the Secretary of State. And Jean Lafitte was pardoned from all of his previous crimes he may have committed. So he went from stealing boats to stealing the hearts of New Orleans' beautiful married ladies. He became a man about town, sort of a local socialite. Anyway, the lesson from this story, it's not about Andrew Jackson's leadership and that speech, let's get over our differences and save the city. And it's not exactly about the British colonel's hubris and actually this really dumb approach to fighting this battle. But it's that in order to beat the odds, a team of people who are all good at their jobs and unified and similar is not nearly going to be as effective as a team with the right kinds of different ways of thinking and working together. So the different perspectives and heuristics that this ragtag army taught each other. The Choctaw Braves teaching the Dirty Shirts how to do guerrilla war and assassinations, which again is sort of ghastly. It was fighting this like an Indian skirmish. It was the pirates and their cannons and the free men of color all combining their different points of view on war that helped them win this battle. And, of course, war is fought very differently now, but at the time, this was very innovative and groundbreaking. So, when Andrew Jackson says, let's set aside our differences and fight this battle, he might say, or we might say, some things are more important than our differences. Saving the city, our superordinate goal that we're trying to achieve. But I think this is an example of something that we all deep down really know. Maybe the important thing is our differences, and we should lean into that. So that's what I got. Thank you very much. And I would love to answer any questions with any little time we have left. And thank you. Is that the microphone?
It is, yes. So I guess I'll ask the first question then.